I attended a series of European Council meetings in Brussels on Wednesday, the 17th of October and Thursday, the 18th of October. The regular meeting of the European Council on the morning of the 18th of October focused on migration, internal security and external relations. On migration, we discussed the implementation of decisions agreed at the June European Council and at the informal summit in Salzburg in September. We exchanged views on the external aspects of migration, including the importance of combating people smuggling networks and strengthening our cooperation with partner countries. Chancellor Kurz of Austria, as current EU presidency, as current holders of the EU presidency, also provides an update on efforts to reform the common EU asylum system and the prospects for progress in this context. On internal security, our discussions focused on recent cyber attacks, cyber security, and the need to protect the Union's democratic systems to combat disinformation ahead of the 2019 European elections. On external relations, we discussed our broader relationship with Africa, and we welcome the decision to convene an EU-African high-level forum in December, and the first EU-Arab League summit in Egypt in February. We also discussed climate change, where we agreed on the importance of reaching the goals and implementing the rules outlined in the Paris Agreement, and on the need for ambition in advance of the COP24 in Poland in December. This is followed by a Euro summit, where we exchanged views on financial issues ahead of the December European Council. I had a bilateral meeting with Prime Minister May on the 17th of October and with the President of the European Parliament, Antonio Tajani, on the 18th of October. I didn't have a formal bilateral meeting with Chancellor Merkel. However, we did speak on a number of occasions during the 2 days, and also with my other EU counterparts in the margins of the European Council. In advance of a meeting of the 27 Member States in Article 50 format on the evening of the 17th of October, Prime Minister May outlined her views to EU leaders and gave the EU perspective on Brexit negotiations. The 27 EU leaders reaffirmed our full confidence in Micheál Barnier as our chief negotiator and urged him to continue his efforts to reach an agreement, in accordance with the guidelines previously agreed by the European Council. President Tusk expressed his readiness to convene a special summit in November if and when Mr Barnier reported that decisive progress had been achieved. At the Article 50 meeting and in my bilateral with Prime Minister May, I stressed the need to protect the Good Friday Agreement and the Northern Ireland peace process, and I said I'd hope that the future relationship between the EU and the UK would be as close, comprehensive and ambitious as possible. I also stressed that it was essential to ensure that a legally robust backstop, which must apply in all circumstances, was set out clearly in the withdrawal agreement. In my bilateral meeting with President Tajani and in my engagement with other EU counterparts, I expressed appreciation for their ongoing strong solidarity on this issue. The deputies will be aware that since the October European Council agreement has been reached at negotiator level on the draft withdrawal agreement and an outline of the joint political declaration on the future relationship, which fully delivers on our negotiating objectives.
That there are 11 questions in this group. We'll need to stick to the allocated time. Deputy Howlin, please.
Thank the Taoiseach for his comprehensive reply, and we will have an opportunity later to deal with, I suppose, the greatest focus for Ireland in relation to European matters, which is the ongoing Brexit situation. But I want to talk to him about the issues that were discussed at the Council in relation to migration and internal security. Just in relation to the whole migration issue, the Taoiseach will be aware that the last remaining rescue vessel operating in the Mediterranean, the Aquarius, is now, if you like, stuck in Marseille because of an arrest warrant issued by the Italian authorities for alleged pollution. And there are no, as far as I'm aware, certainly NGO-operated rescue vessels now. Médecins Sans Frontières are reporting hundreds of migrants or attempted migrants drowning as a result of this. Is there a rescue process in place? Does the Taoiseach have a view on the policy that obviously we committed naval vessels to over the number of years, of ensuring that people who, often at the behest of people smugglers, there's no escaping that reality, but are so desperate to take to the sea in completely unsuitable craft, and putting themselves and their children at mortal risk. Do we have an attitude to that, and what are we going to do about it? In terms of general migration, I welcome obviously the Africa Summit, but what is our policy? What is the European Union policy on migration? Obviously there are very strong views now being expressed by the new Italian government, by some of the eastern countries. But is there an integrated migration and asylum policy emerging, and can we have a real debate about that and what participation Ireland has in it? And in relation to the security issues, two brief questions. One, could you just specify exactly what measures we're going to take to protect our democracy in terms of the European elections? What was decided? And what was your response to Angela Merkel's comments about the creation of a European army?
Deputy Micheál Martin.
There will be a full debate later today on the draft withdrawal agreement, so I will leave most of my points on that until then. But I would like to ask the Taoiseach if he will comment on the reports that Prime Minister May is discussing a new backstop text in Brussels, which he hopes will appease some of her Brexiteer backbenchers and ministers. Specifically, can you assure us, Taoiseach, that nothing has been discussed which would impact on the substance of the draft agreement, which we'll be voting on later this afternoon? Now, as you know, Taoiseach, President Macron and Chancellor Merkel have reached an in-principle agreement concerning the creation of a Eurozone-specific budget, which would give a greater ability to the Eurozone to respond to downturns. This is a very reasonable proposal, in my view, which Ireland should strongly support. The lack of such a funding mechanism and such funding was at the root of much of the financial crisis and was a real issue in terms of the capacity of the Eurozone to respond to the global recession that occurred in 2008 onwards, financial recession and crisis, and obviously which had a significant impact on Ireland. It's also been reported, Taoiseach, that you are joining with other countries in opposing that proposal from Merkel and Macron. Can you outline in the House whether it is true that Ireland is actually opposing this essential reform? And if that is the case, why is Ireland taking up a position of being one of the most conservative countries on the EU budget when we should actually be one of its biggest supporters?
Just 2 points I wanted to ask you about. The media carries quite extensive suggestions today that the Max FAC is back on the table, the maximum facilitation mode, in relation to, as it were, not requiring or being able to end the backstop quite early. That this is an olive branch that Prime Minister Theresa May is proposing to offer to Eurosceptics in her own Parliament. And I just wanted to ask you if that particular element of the long discussions that have taken place over the last period, whether or not that was discussed in terms of the Council and in terms of potential discussions to ward off, if you like, a very hard Brexit. Secondly, as well, I understand that at that Council meeting, PESCO was discussed in the context of there being quite ambitious proposals in relation to significant increases in military spending, in the context not necessarily of a European army as put forward by your colleague President Macron, but more in the sense that European armies would all invest very, very heavily in very advanced modern weaponry and systems. And I would like to know whether, in fact, you have signed up Ireland to that broadening and deepening of PESCO, and in particular of the potential budget to be spent on armaments by European countries.
You were reported as having made what I consider extremely alarming comments at the weekend about the possibility of a no-deal Brexit. Comments that, quite frankly, confirm some of the worst fears that we've articulated about assurances you've given, that Michel Barnier has given and Juncker have given on the issue of the border, the north-south border. You said, or at least you were reported to have said, I think in a no-deal scenario it would be very difficult to avoid a hard border. As Ireland is remaining part of the European Union, we would no doubt be required to implement European law. Now that sounds to me like if there is a no-deal, that you are saying that Europe will require us to impose a border to protect the single market and that you are willing to do that. Now, if that's not the case, I'd like clarification, because that is a very significant development, if that is the case. I've always feared that was the case, and I have sought multiple assurances that in the event that there is no deal, that we simply tell Europe and Britain we are not in any way cooperating with the installation of a border. And indeed, I would go further, Taoiseach, if you believe this is a real possibility, I think you should be out arguing that if that is a threat, that there should be a border poll, north and south, to give people the opportunity to make a decision democratically as to whether that is what they want. So I'd be interested in your response on that, Taoiseach, and it has very considerable bearing on the motion we will discuss tonight and the vote that will be taken.
We have two further questioners. Can we give this batch of questions an extra 10 minutes? There's 11 questions, okay. Sorry, now who's next? Deputy Eamon Ryan, please.
With regard to discussion at the European Council in the integrity of our election system, the risks from interference in social advertising or the undue influence of money that's not accountable on social media platforms, there will be a visit from our Joint Oireachtas Commission Communications to Westminster next week to discuss this issue. The UK, Facebook, companies such as Facebook in the UK have agreed to introduce on their own mechanisms an accounting mechanism to show where political advertising is taking place so that it's clearly identified, the values and volumes of money spent and so on can be made clear. If we can't get the sort of legislation that Deputy Lawless and others have been working on for such transparency, will you push the social media companies here to introduce the same mechanisms so we don't see undue influence in our local European or indeed next general election from such spending on such platforms?
And Taoiseach, I think you have to clarify two things for us. Firstly, whether or not the maximum facilitation, a proposal that was rejected by Europe for very, very sound reasons, whether or not that is being advanced again, whether any other similar proposition is being advanced that would hollow out or offer anything that was less than that which is afforded in the current backstop. Can you clarify for that for us? I agree with Deputy Boyd Barrett. It's not good enough for the Taoiseach to be an observer from afar, speculating on the prospect of a hard border. There can't be a hard border on the island. That must remain our position. So can I put it to you also that in the event that there is a hard border, where stands the Taoiseach's thinking in respect to a referendum on unity to remove that border? And thirdly, I want to echo the alarm with which talk of a European army. It's not new, but it's being advanced in a very, very proactive, almost aggressive way now by Macron and others. This state is still nominally, at least, a military neutral. Can I ask you, Taoiseach, have you signed up, have you an understanding with Monsieur Macron or with Merkel or anybody else in respect of your position on the prospect of a European army?
Thanks very much for the questions, deputies. As I understand it, under the international law of the sea, vessels have an obligation to rescue people in distress. So if a vessel is in distress and if people are lost at sea or at risk of drowning, there's an international obligation on nearby vessels to engage in search and rescue. We do need to bear in mind, though, and we've done that, of course. The Irish Navy vessels have been involved in search and rescue. in the Mediterranean, as of many other navies as well. But I think we also need to bear in mind that in doing so, we need to not do anything that helps human trafficking. And part of the mandate of the mission in the Mediterranean is to disrupt human trafficking. And we do have people, human traffickers, who are putting very vulnerable people in essentially large dinghies, in unseaworthy vessels, in vessels that they know full well will sink long before they get to the coast of Europe. And we need to make sure that nothing that we do in terms of search and rescue encourages or assists human traffickers in putting people at risk and putting them in vessels in that way. And that's exactly what has been happening. People, very vulnerable people who've trekked across Africa to get to the coast of Libya, being put in unseaworthy vessels by human traffickers with the expectation that they will be rescued either by European navies or by NGO vessels. So we need to always bear that in mind in what we do, because those people's lives are being put at risk, and we shouldn't facilitate that in any way. In terms of the EU policy on migration, I think it's fair to say that there's a lot of division around the table. Countries have different perspectives on how we should manage migration. Absolutely everyone around the table, with the exception, of course, of the UK that's leaving, is very much in favour of freedom of movement, and there's no debate, no one questioning freedom of movement within the European Union. Austria, Hungary, Poland, Italy all support free movement within the European Union. What many of them object to is migration from outside the European Union, or illegal migration, people arriving and not going through the correct ports, not filing documents on arrival, doing the things that we expect people to do. Where there is agreement on is three things. First of all, that we need greater cooperation with the transit countries and the countries of origin. Those countries on the North African coast and Turkey that are largely countries of transit, and those countries in the Middle East and in Africa that are source countries for much of this migration. And people are leaving these countries because they don't have democracy, because they don't have civil and human rights, because they don't have economic opportunity. And the best way to deal with uncontrolled migration such as this is to bring about democracy and security and economic opportunity in those countries. We don't see huge numbers of people coming from Asian countries into Europe in the same way, largely because so many people have been lifted out of poverty in those countries through economic development. And that's the first principle by which we apply, and Ireland is very much committing to that too, through our increases in funding for international development in particular, an increase of over 100 million in 2019. The second area where there's agreement on is the need to enhance external border security, the border between Bulgaria and Turkey, for example, and also security in the Mediterranean through agreements with Morocco, Libya, assisting them to build up their coast guard, for example, and Egypt as well. And the third area, which we don't all agree on, but most of us agree on, is a degree of solidarity and burden sharing, being willing to accept migrants from other countries. And Ireland has done that now on a series of occasions where we've been asked by Malta and Italy and Greece to take some migrants, and we've done that. And that's an example of us showing solidarity with those countries on the front line. In terms of a European army, I've had no discussions with either President Macron or Chancellor Merkel about that. Obviously, I've heard what they've had to say about it, but they haven't approached us to join a European army, and I don't anticipate that they will be. Ireland isn't going to be participating in the European army, nor are we going to be joining NATO. We have decided, though, and this was done by resolution of this House, to participate in PESCO, which is structured European cooperation around defence and security, and we're doing that on a case-by-case basis, and that's very much to our advantage. Ireland is a small country with a small military. We don't have much to offer in terms of military prowess or might to the European Union, but there are lots of things that we can offer. Humanitarian assistance and training, which our Navy is doing, for example, with Operation Sophia, participation in peacekeeping operations, which we've done very well for decades, assisting in European security in areas like cyber terrorism, terrorism intelligence, and that's where I think we can make a contribution. I don't envisage us joining a European army, nor do I envisage us being asked to join the European army. Our position as a neutral, non-aligned state is well understood by our European partners, and the same goes for Austria and Finland, who are very much in the same position as us. I hear this statement being thrown around all the time that somehow we've committed to increasing our defence budget to 2% of GDP. We haven't, and we won't. We won't be doing that. But our defence budget will increase over the next couple of years. It'll increase because of pay rises for our Defence Force personnel. It'll increase because of improvements to our barracks. It'll increase because of the fact that we're purchasing new equipment, ships, aircraft, vessels and vehicles that we need. So there will be an increase in defence spending, and I stand over that increase in defence spending that's happening next year and in the years to come. But it won't be getting anywhere close 2% of our GDP, which would be, I don't know, 6 billion or something. Won't be anywhere near a fraction of that. Just in relation to the Northern Ireland Protocol and the backstop, we haven't had any discussions about revisions to the text, either with the Commission or with the UK Government, since it was stabilised last week. It is important, though, to remember the format that is there in the December joint report, options A, B and C. Option A being the future relationship, option B being specific solutions that the UK may propose, option C being the backstop. And what's come into the mix since then is D, if you like, which is an extension of the transition period. But whatever happens, what's required at the end of all of that is a backstop that is legally operative, that applies unless and until an alternative solution supersedes it. And I want to state again on the record of the House, it is our intention and our commitment as a government to work with the United Kingdom and the European Union to come up with a future relationship which doesn't require that the backstop ever be invoked in full or in part. And if it is invoked, that will only be there for a temporary period as a bridge to a future relationship. On the Eurozone budget, we're not opposed to it outright, nor are we backing it either. It's something that we will give consideration to, but we'll need to see how this proposal develops. I think a Eurozone budget could be useful in a time of economic crisis, for example. It could operate as an economic and fiscal stabiliser. If, for example, a proportion of unemployment benefits were paid for on a European level, countries that have high levels of unemployment would benefit from that during periods of recession, and of course would help other countries out when they don't have high levels of unemployment. But one thing we need to be very careful about is anything that may impact on our sovereignty and our tax sovereignty in particular. If there is a European budget with money in it to be spent, well then that money has to be raised somehow. And we would be concerned that any proposal for a Eurozone budget may suggest imposing Europe-wide taxes, which we couldn't accept. So we're entering into discussions on a Eurozone budget with an understandable degree of scepticism. We'll need to see the detail, what it actually is, or not even the detail, a better understanding of what's being proposed before we can agree to it.